We've decoded the intel from
MetaWatch.
Spy, and it confirms the worst. Somehow
Aeldari.
returned.
What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another episode of Best Armies in Warhammer 40k. This is the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the past weekend of large-scale competitive events, GT and larger. And we had a fairly big weekend this week with a lot of smaller GT events going down, as well as a couple major and super major level events, such as the Alpine Cup singles. Before we jump into it, I want to give a quick shout out. I did spend all weekend streaming the Midgard GT, which we'll talk about the results of later on in this video. That was an incredibly competitive event and some of the best games of 10th edition 40k that I've streamed so far on the channel this edition. For those who don't know, I do live stream periodically on the channel, usually when events request for me to go stream with them, and I will be live this coming weekend, that being the weekend of the 13th and 14th, at the Florida ATC team event. So please like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the little notification thing so that you get notified when I go live, because I have a ton of events on my docket in the next couple of months, and we are going to be live streaming a ton on the channel. Big thanks to everybody who came and hung out with me over the weekend while I live streamed that, and I hope to see you in a future live stream. It was a good weekend for live streaming competitive 40k. We had several live streamers going basically 24/7 over the course of the weekend, and the first one being the first event that we're going to talk about once we get to a metagame breakdown with some surprising results. First off being Aeldari with 3 undefeated results, the biggest one from the Alpine Cup singles, that being the largest event of the weekend, and that was streamed over at Wargames Live, streamed both the singles and team event from that tournament. Since the beginning of the edition, Aeldari was the boogeyman, but they have been nerfed several times, and we haven't really seen them rear their ugly heads for the last couple of weeks. However, it seems like they're coming back in style with undefeated results at the Alpine Cup singles, as I mentioned, the Imperialis Capilla GT, as well as the Wild Hunt GT. Necrons are continuously doing well. They're not showing any signs of slowing down, taking down the Iberian Barcelona GT, as well as having undefeated results at the Peterborough Slam and Wild Hunt GT. Speaking of that Iberian Barcelona event, Tau Empire also went undefeated at that one, although they didn't take first place. They also were undefeated at the Iron Cage GT. Thousand Suns, similar to Tau Empire, also went undefeated at that Iberian Barcelona GT. That was also an extremely large major plus level event, over 100 players, but only went 5 rounds. So we saw several undefeated results at that event. Similarly, Thousand Suns also took second place at the Alpine Cup. Although that wasn't technically an undefeated result, the Alpine Cup singles event cut to top 2 for its final playoffs. So players played through 5 rounds of 40k before cutting to the top highest undefeated results. All the other players didn't get to play the final round, but those top 2 did, and the winner obviously being Aeldari, but with Thousand Suns as the follow-up. So they weren't technically undefeated over the course of the weekend, but they were undefeated up until that point, which I think is worth mentioning. Dark Angels doing particularly well with a win at the Iron Cage GT alongside Dark Sphere April. We also saw Black Templars win the appropriately named Black Tower Brawl. Ultramarines go undefeated with an X0-1 record at Imperialis Capilla. I don't think we're going to be talking about that one in this video. They did come out with a draw in that event, and also the list is just sort of a normal Vanguard spearhead list, so not too much interesting to talk about there. Adeptus Custodes took down the Perils of the Geekery GT. Orks at the Midgard GT that I streamed myself, so if you want to go see the results of that Orc list, you can go check it out over the live tab on the channel. Genestealer Cults taking down Courage and Honor 9. Death Guard, another undefeated result from the Dark Sphere April. Chaos Knights taking down one of the larger events of the weekend, the Radicalism GT. Josh Pope going undefeated at that one. Pretty cool to see Chaos Knights coming out of the woodwork to put up some good results. Another large event from the weekend, the Scorched Earth GT, another major level event won by Astra Militarum. This one was streamed over on Tabletop Live and had an absolute nail-biter of a finals game. I was in the chat for that one, and oh boy, was that one an exciting game. So go check those guys out. They do great coverage over there on Tabletop Live. Now, last but certainly not least, Grey Knights with only a single undefeated result from a smaller event. This was the Fool's Errand GT with an X0-1 record for the Grey Knights. A little bit of a fall from grace after their incredible showing last week. Players are finally unlocking that Nemesis Dread Knight technology to make those guys do lots of damage, but we saw a lot of players go down this weekend. Not so many of them having the same success this weekend as they did in the past. I think people are maybe a little bit more wary of what Grey Knights and their Nemesis Dread Knights can do and are a little bit more prepared for the unique style of ranged engagement that they can bring to the table. And with that, we'll dive into the lists, starting with Aeldari. Today we're going to be talking about the Alpine Cup singles event. Again, that was streamed over on War Games Live. That was won by Liam Vissel. Liam is an Aeldari specialist and an Eldar player extraordinaire, and played an extremely unique variety of Eldar that we haven't really seen too much so far. This list was running an Autarch Wayleaper with the Phoenix Gem, not too much exciting there, alongside Fuegan and Yvraine. We also then saw a 10-man unit of Storm Guardians with a shield platform, 3 units of 5 Dark Reapers. Those have Tempest launchers attached onto their Exarchs. That gives the army a little bit of indirect fire, a little bit of reach into objective scoring units sitting in the back line. And since Dark Reapers ignore hit modifiers and ballistic skill penalties when shooting their weapons, they actually ignore the indirect fire penalty with the Tempest launcher. You just get cover if they're shooting at you, which makes them relatively effective anti-infantry blast weapons to be firing indirectly, and they have some pretty solid profiles when shooting directly with their reapers themselves. In terms of utility, the list had a ton of it. 5 Rangers alongside 3 units of 5 Swooping Hawks. We then had 3 units of 5 Warp Spiders, 2 units of 2 Skyweavers, those ones equipped with Haywire Cannons and Zephyr Glaives, adding a little bit of anti-tank shooting to the list, and a little bit of additional fast movers that can be used to score utility objectives. We had a ton of Aspect Warriors beyond the enormous number of Aspect Warriors I've already talked about, including 2 units of 5 Shadow Specters, which are super useful for their pretty solid anti-tank shooting alongside their shoot ability, so they can jump back into cover after firing, and 3 units of 5 Warp Spiders, who act as both utility and damage output, with devastating wounds on their auto-hitting Death Spinners, but also the ability to warp jump immense distances if you need them to complete secondary. Last but certainly not least, we had a Wave Serpent alongside a big unit of 12 Harlequin Troopers. Those guys could attach into Yvraine, give Yvraine a little bit of a benefit on her sword, because she has a pretty solid sword already, but she also makes the unit significantly harder to take down. Overall, super interesting list. We have seen Aspect Warrior styles of Eldar played in the past, but usually they focus on Falcons backing up more heavy hitters, things like Fire Dragons. Today, we are just taking basically the maximum number of small infantry squads that we possibly can, and that makes this army incredibly good at scoring objectives, incredibly good at screening out aggressive enemies, pinning them in place, and then using tons and tons of individual activations, all buffed by the Battle Host detachment ability to chip away at its opponent and inflict a death by 1,000 cuts. Moving over to Necrons, we had the winner of another one of the majors of the weekend at the Iberian Barcelona event. David Ondukas went undefeated with a Hypercrypt Legion, and it is a relatively standard variety of Hypercrypt with a little bit of spice added in. The list was running 2 Catan Shards, a Catan Shard of the Nightbringer, as well as one of the Void Dragon, which is to be expected, alongside Imhotep the Stormlord to give it some key back, a Plasmancer with the Risen Tyrant to give rerolls when they deep strike, and a Technomancer with Dimensional Overseer. The Plasmancer was attaching into a unit of 10 Immortals, those guys equipped with Tesla Carbines and benefiting from the Plasmancer's enhanced critical hits ability, so getting reroll to hits and criticaling on 5s, so we're firing tons of Tesla shots that are then giving additional chances to critical to get the Sustain 2, plus a Risen Tyrant to reroll all of those to get even better chances to Sustain 2, and the Immortals rerolling wounds against enemies on objectives naturally, allowing the normally relatively pillow-fisted Tesla weapons to do actually kind of an insane amount of damage. We then had the Technomancer with Dimensional Overseer. That guy was obviously increasing the budget of hyper-phased units that you can have in the army, but also attaching into a unit of 6 Canoptic Wraiths to give them a Field Out Pain and give the list a little bit of staying power, something that Hypercrypt Legion doesn't always have. We then had a Locust Lord with the Osteoclave Fulcrum. That gives the bearer and his unit unit Deep Strike, and he was jumping into a unit of 6 Locust Destroyers. He's also improving their critical hits, giving their lethal hits on their Gauss cannons on 5-ups rather than just 6s. Oftentimes we see this guy with the Risen Tyrant to do basically the same thing that we are doing with the Immortal unit and the Plasmancer, but on lethal hits for the Gauss cannons. Instead, we're just going to be using that Osteoclave Fulcrum to allow the unit to hop up and down with impunity, not having to come off the table edge when it hyperphase or use Cosmic Precision. Having Deep Strike also allows them to redeploy in turn 1, which is a big deal. I explained exactly how that works in a video I made a couple weeks ago. We also had 2 units of Death Marks for the same reason. Those guys naturally Deep Strike, so they're able to use hyperphasing to jump around the table on the first battle round. And we had a unit of 2 Cryptothralls alongside a Monolith, do some Monolith shenanigans, hopping the infantry in and out on first turn if you are using the Monolith to hyperphase, bring the Immortals out. And we didn't have any Chronomancers to move the Immortals after shooting, but typically when they are coming out of the Eternity Gate of the Monolith, they don't actually need the Chronomancer to move after shooting because they can just deploy outside engagement range of enemies. As long as they're wholly within 6 of the Monolith, they can show up basically anywhere on the table, which makes the army incredibly flexible. In terms of scoring, we also had a unit of 3 Canoptic Scarab Swarms. That was the entirety of the list. While it is the bones of a standard Hypercrypt Legion that we've been seeing basically since LVO, we do have a little bit of spice in here. The Locust Lord is a conclusion, and I don't think him and his big boat of Locust Destroyers or even Locust Heavy Destroyers is played as much as it probably should be. And that moves us on to Tau Empire. Today we're going to be talking about Christian Alessi's list from the Iron Cage GT. Now I will basically go through this one pretty quickly because we are awaiting points values for the updated codex for the army, which makes a lot of these lists probably look a lot different. So we're not going to spend too much time on Tau Empire today, but this list in particular had an exemplar of the Kalyan Fireblade, so he's going to be giving +1 attack to the unit he's attached to, and then sustain 2 on round 2 onwards, as long as they're guided. He can attach into one of the 3 Breacher teams in the army to do absolutely insane damage with that relatively inexpensive little unit. We then had Commander Shadowsun to grant passive rerolls of 1 in an aura, alongside Long Strike, 4 Devilfish to include the 3 Breacher teams, as well as the 1 Pathfinder team in the army, 3 Hammerhead gunships that can be buffed by Long Strike potentially, all of those running rail guns, alongside 3 Riptide battle suits with ion accelerators to add some anti-heavy infantry shooting to the army to back up the Hammerhead's anti-tank shooting, and 2 Tetras to guide and grant rerolls, especially to those Breacher teams. We've been seeing the insane damage that Breacher teams can do pretty prevalently in lists recently. The fact that they're very aggressive and can do a ton of damage to basically any defensive profile makes the unit extremely valuable. And whether or not they increase in points value in the new codex is gonna, I think, determine a lot of how Tau lists are built once that codex is fully released. Moving on to Thousand Suns, we're gonna go back to the Iberian Barcelona event where Taroxer went undefeated with the faction. Didn't win the event, but that was just down to tiebreakers. Ended up losing it out to Necrons, but was still 5-0 at the end of the weekend. This list was running Ahriman alongside 2 Exalted Sorcerers on discs, one of them with the Umbralific Crystal. That allows them to teleport around the table, and those Exalted Sorcerers, once they get line of sight to you and are within 18 inches, can Binding Tendrils you to slow you down. That makes Thousand Suns incredibly effective against very aggressive, especially foot-oriented, maybe infantry armies. Armies like Orks or Adeptus Custodes hate to see these guys because they're going to add control effects all over the place, and alongside the Lord of Forbidden Lore, which we have on a Thousand Sun Sorcerer, we can potentially be double moving those Exalted Sorcerers to safety every turn to allow them to continuously slow down enemies and then run away. We also had an Infernal Master with Arcane Vortex, Magnus the Red, as well as a Demon Prince to protect him. We then had 4 units of 5 Rubric Marines, those guys equipped with Soul Reaper Cannons and Warp Flamers, alongside a Thousand Suns Rhino to protect a couple of them, 1 unit of Cultists, 1 Mutalith Vortex Beast, and 1 unit of Zangor Enlightened to score some points. Overall, normal Thousand Suns fare, but it is cool to see Thousand Suns doing fairly well, and again, they did also get 2nd place at Alpine Cup, so we had a couple really strong Thousand Suns players do fairly well with the faction this weekend. And that moves us on to Dark Angels, where Cam Hawkins took the faction to an undefeated record at the Iron Cage GT, actually winning the event, but they also took down the Dark Spear April GT as well. Cam was running an Ironstorm Spearhead led by Azrael, so not much Dark Angels flavor, but we are still in the chapter. This was running 3 Tech Marines, one with each of the special enhancements that makes the detachment so good: Target Augury Web, Adept of the Omnissiah, and Master of Machine War. We then had a Dark Shroud backing up 3 Redemptor Dreadnoughts, 2 Scout Squads, a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike, and 2 Stormraven Gunships, alongside a Calidus Assassin and some Inquisitorial Henchmen to act as utility. We've talked about this list a couple times. Basically, it's just a pretty wild defense skew. The Stormraven Gunships can start on the table. They are -1 damage and -1 to be hit when standing next to the Dark Shrouds, and then they can drop off the Redemptor Dreadnoughts to give them a little bit of additional threat range, and potentially even drop off the Tech Marines as well if you don't need their buff on the first turn. That gives the list an enormous wall of stealthy -1 damage, high armor save idiots who can be protected by Adept of the Omnissiah and kind of trundle up the table. This list, I think, has been called affectionately by the internet the Lion Storm list, because it's you got Azrael in it, and it's also an Iron Storm, and is very effective. We've seen it do pretty well over the last couple of weeks, and I think we'll continue to see it do well moving on into the near future. Now, we'll continue on with Space Marines, because we do have an undefeated result from Mike Porter playing Black Templars. This is also an Iron Storm Spearhead. So if we're looking for unique and chapter-specific technology, unfortunately we don't have any of that right now, but Iron Storm Spearhead, as it turns out, is really good. So a lot of people are playing it. This list is actually kind of wild. It's running 2 Tech Marines, one with Target Augury Web, one with Adept of the Omnissiah. That Target Augury Web is going to be important in order to benefit the 4 Gladiator Reapers that are included in the list. That's right, we had a grand total of 4, 3 Black Templars Gladiator Reapers that pay a little bit of a surcharge to get a top-mounted multi-melta, but we also had a standard one as well. Now, the benefit of these guys is that they have a hugely high-volume twin-linked weapon on their turret. You can use Mercy as weakness to get critical 5-ups, as well as sustain 2 when shooting at infantry to get enormous numbers of additional hits with those sustained. You can then use Target Augury Web to allow those 5-ups to be automatic wounds, so when you roll a 5-up, you get 2 normal wounds plus an automatic wound. Because the weapon's twin linked, once you go to your normal wound roll, you can then re-roll it, and it being an onslaught Gatling cannon, it is devastating damage as well. So if you're fishing for 6s, you can potentially be generating a ton of additional critical hits with that effect. Especially when shooting at heavy infantry, units like Adeptus Custodes, for example, the combination of the Stain 2 and critical 5-ups is absolutely disastrous for them. However, when shooting at basically anything, having a just high volume of pretty solid twin-linked devastating shooting is enough to put several damage on basically anything in the game. And backing that up with a multi-melta shot off the pintle mount is also pretty sweet as well. That said, we also had some interesting spice in the list. Alternatively, we had 2 Eliminator squads, Instigator Bolt Carbines, and 1 Impulsor. Those guys could then, assuming that the event allows this, because it is kind of a controversial combo, disembark the Impulsor, fire their Las Fusils to potentially do a couple damage to something, using their Iron Storm floating reroll on each unit independently as they do so, then use their Instigator Bolt Carbine to move after shooting, embark into the Impulsor, and then have the Impulsor use their weapons again to fire out of their firing deck, allowing it to shoot a total of 8 Las Fusil shots with 3 total floating rerolls. That's, it is a relatively expensive combo, almost 250 points for the 2 units plus the Impulsor, but it is a lot of anti-tank shooting, and once they're in the Impulsor, can benefit from most of the synergies that the Iron Storm Spearhead has for vehicle use. For example, the Target Augury Web, giving it lethal hits. We then also had an Incursor squad, 2 Predator Destructors, again more anti-heavy infantry technology, 2 units of Scout squads, 1 Stormraven gunship for most of the same reasons that we talked about previously. They are a fast aircraft if you need it, potentially hard to kill unit that puts a lot of anti-tank shooting on the table and can embark some of your infantry if you needed to. 1 Calidus Assassin for scoring, and I didn't mention it, but there is a nice little Gladiator Lancer in there as well to add some additional long-range anti-tank to back up the kind of ludicrous amount of anti-infantry that the 3 Gladiator Reapers give the army. Now, speaking of anti-heavy infantry, let's talk about exactly what you would be using those big onslaught Gatling cannons against, that largely being Adeptus Custodes. We're going to move over to the Perils of the Geekery GT, where Trainer Wolf went 6-0 with an Adeptus Custodes list. Trainer was running a Blade Champion, Shield Captain with Ceaseless Hunter, and Trajan Valoris, the Blade Champion, also running the Veiled Blade. We basically talked about a combination of characters like this in our review last week, I believe, because we had each of those characters attached to a unit of Custodian Wardens. So they had their -1 be wounded and their once per game 4+ feel no pain. Now, interestingly, we just talked about a lot about those devastating wound anti-infantry guns over on the Black Templar Reapers, but you don't really care so much that the Custodians have a baked-in 4+ feel no pain against devastating damage if you're already fighting against the Custodian Wardens once per game 4+ feel no pain anyway. So getting the devastating damage is basically just additional expected value, even against those units that are already relatively hard to wound. We then had 2 Caladius Grav tanks to add some long-range shooting with heavy blaze cannons to the army that allows them to fight against those anti-heavy infantry vehicles. Things like Predator Destructors and the Gladiator Reapers will go down fairly quickly to the Caladius Grav tanks if the Ironstorm Spearhead or whatever they're fighting against can't pick up those Caladii very quickly. That also means that your opponent can't really play in the Sprinkler. A lot of times what people can do against armies that are not super heavily shooting oriented is play out of cover and get perfect positions wherever they want them to be, and having a couple Caladius Grav tanks to just rinse down whatever is standing out in the open definitely dissuades your opponent from playing as aggressively. We then had 1 unit of Prosecutors as well as a unit of 5 Custodian Guard. Those guys we're going to attach to Lord Inquisitor Kyria Draxus because she's incredible with them, getting wound rerolls on her own weapons as well as the ability to double shoot and her own psychic effect to make them untargetable by ranged attacks makes this unit absolutely monstrous, and there's a reason that basically every single Custodian list is running Kyria Draxus. And with that, we will move on to Orks. Stephen Pranpreen took down the Midgard April GT with Orks, and as a reminder, I feel like a broken record here, but I did live stream that whole GT. We live streamed both the semifinals and finals games with Stephen Pranpreen's Orks, and oh boy, were the finals pretty spicy. Stephen was running a Deathkiller Wartrike with Super Cyborg Body. That guy is just really hard to kill and moves really fast. He's got a 4+ feel no pain baked in and pretty fast movement, can run around again, grab secondaries, set on objectives, contest stuff, do normal utility unit things while being kind of tanky. We had Captain Badruck to jump into a unit of 10 flash kits alongside 3 war bosses, one of them with Follow Me Lads, and 2 knobs with Wa banners. Last but certainly not least, and complementing the Deathkiller Wartrike, we also had a Weird Boy. That guy wasn't attached to anything. He would just sit in the back and then use to jump on himself to teleport himself around the table and complete secondaries. Probably blowing his head up in the process, but as long as he scored you a couple points, that's really all that mattered. We then had 3 units of 20 boys for those 3 war bosses to jump into. Those guys getting +1 to hit from the war bosses. Then 2 knobs with Wa banners could double attach alongside the war bosses to give the army a sort of echoing effect on its Wa. It could start 1 unit of boys on the table or in an aggressively positioned battle wagon. There are 2 battle wagon in the list, by the way. Call a Wa themselves or use the knob banner to call a Wa if they were already on the table. Run up and engage your opponent and then bring a 2nd unit of boys in reserve or up in a 2nd battle wagon. You could then do it again, either calling the natural Wa or using the Wa banner knob to get that unit a 2nd turn of Wa-ing, and then you could do it a 3rd turn with the 3rd unit. So you basically get 3 turns of Wa with a big, enormous unit of boys stuck in with a war boss that hits like an absolute Mack truck with a ton of choppa attacks and sustained hits, potential benefits from Unbridled Carnage as well. And the pièce de résistance for this list was actually 2 kill rigs as well. The kill rigs, I think, is a unit that we don't really see often enough in Orks. They're fairly good at attacking themselves as well as being kind of hard to kill and having unexpectedly good ranged attack profile. They have a Word Tower, which is a torrent las cannon, effectively. It automatically hits for strength 12, AP3, D6 damage, which is pretty good. And they have a psychic power to grant +1 strength potential lethal hits to a nearby unit, either buffing themselves or other kill rigs or buffing your units of 20 boys that are running up the table. Because that effect is a targeted buff, not an aura, it also stacks, so you can put both kill rigs buffs on a single Orc boys squad if you really want to supercharge them. And that allows the Orc boys to actually punch through much heavier defensive profiles than you would normally expect them to, especially with those attached characters characters like the Warbane Nob, the Warboss, and the Nob inside the boys squad itself. Those guys have pretty solid profiles. Once buffed with a couple of additional strength and sustained hits and potentially improved criticals, they can actually do a ton of damage themselves, not even counting the 19 additional boys that we have elsewhere in the unit. Following that up, we then had a unit of Gretchen for some utility and CP generation, and that was the list. It was mostly the Orc Boys show, being delivered by battle wagons, buffed by the kill rigs, and doing immense damage. Now, speaking of hordes of boys, we can kind of keep the theme going by talking about Genestealer Cult, who were taken to a 5-0 record by Andrew Lewis at the Courage and Honor 9 event. Andrew was running a Clamavis, Kellermorph, Nexos, Inscrutable Cunning to give his unit infiltration.
The other benefit for that combo too is that the Nexos gives you stratagems for free and can then trigger Inscrutable Cunning's second ability to gain CP back, even if the stratagem didn't cost anything to begin with.
2 Primuses, Primuses, alongside 2 Reductus Saboteur. Those guys could attach into one of the 4 units of Acolyte hybrids that the list was bringing, those guys equipped with demolition charges and hand flamers. We also had 1 unit of 10 neophyte hybrids to hold down the fort, and 2 units of 20 neophyte hybrids to bring seismic cannons and grenade launchers for some longer ranged anti-tank shooting. We had 1 Goliath truck in the list, which the Acolyte hybrids could hop into and use as a springboard to do some additional damage, 1 Achilles Ridge Runner to increase their AP with crossfire, and, interestingly, 3 units of Catachan Jungle Fighters, which is a super cool inclusion. For 55 points a unit, these guys offer something to Genestealer Cults they don't really have access to elsewhere outside of a couple different units, that just being scouts. While Genestealer Cults are extremely good at infiltrating, especially once we consider that Nexos with Screenable Cunning throwing units up into the middle of the table, what they don't have is pregame moves very much. They have a couple units that can do so, but none of their chaff really have access to that ability. And instead, we can just pay 55 points for a unit of Catachan Jungle Fighters to do it. That means that you can force your opponent's early screens back, either trying to kill them with the Catachan Jungle Fighters, clearing them out, because those units actually have 2 flamers attached into each of them, which definitely helps when trying to kill chaff infantry that are screening out your drops, and then opening the way for the neophyte hybrids and the acolyte hybrids to jump in the middle of the table and blow some stuff up. Cool inclusion here. We don't really see Brood Brothers played with that often in Genestealer Cult lists, and I definitely think it's a little unexplored territory, and it's really cool to see Andrew rocking those Catachan Jungle Fighters complement the strengths of the Genestealer Cult faction. Moving on from that, we have some Death Guard to talk about. Speaking of allies, this faction's basically the NATO of the 41st millennium. This list was running a very heavily armored variety of Death Guard, but we aren't seeing the benefit of Mortarion this time around. Instead, we do have 2 fully charged units of Plague Marines. This is led by 2 Biologus Putrefiers and 2 Foul Blightspawn. Each of those can jump into one of the Plague Marine units, each unit getting one of each of the special characters to get their fight first, Super Flamer off the Blightspawn, as well as the enhanced lethals and grenades from the Putrefier. We then had a Lord of Virulence that was jumping into a unit of 3 Death Shroud Terminators to give them wound rerolls on their little tiny baby flamers, alongside the Blight Bombardment for the 2 Plague Bridge Crawlers that were also included in the list. We then had 3 Predator Destructors. There's so much heavy infantry hate in the meta right now that the Predator Destructors definitely fit in. Those guys are rocking las cannons on their sponsons as well as their big auto cannon, and they do suffer a little bit from having a medium AP value, especially as long as they're not shooting at infantry, but it does improve a little bit when they shoot at infantry, but that can also be buffed as well by the Death Guard's Contagion to reduce their armor save, which makes the Predator Destructor feel a lot more efficient as a ranged damage platform. These guys for 130 points are putting potentially 8 pretty high impact shots down range and getting around the traditional downsides of the Predator Destructor profile using the buffs that Death Guard can bring them. We then had 2 Death Guard Rhinos to jump the Plague Marines into, alongside 2 units of Nurglings and a War Dog Brigand and a Fetid Bloat Drone to act as utility. Now, keeping on the Chaos trend, we also had Chaos Knights take down the Radicalism event. This was a relatively large GT, 70 players, I believe, and was taken down by Chaos Knights, which was pretty cool to see. These guys were led by Josh Pope, running a War Dog Stalker, 6 War Dog Carnivores, and 4 units of 3 Nurglings. Mostly standard Chaos Knights fare, not too much to see here. Turns out a lot of War Dogs is good. And Josh Pope is taking the good stuff, so more power to him. Now, as we move on to the end of our list here, we actually have one of the larger events of the weekend, the Scorched Earth GT, which was won by Ben Urich, who's back on Astra Militarum. Ben was running a mostly standard variety of Astra Militarum with a couple small tweaks in there. This was led by Lord Solar Leontis with a platoon command squad, 2 tank commanders, and Ursula Creed. We could attach the platoon command squad and Lord Solar into the Catachan Jungle Fighter unit that's also in the list, to give him access to their Master Vox. We also have Ursula to give overlapping fields of fire on the mortar team of Platoon Command Squad to buff the AP of anything in the army for no cost. We then had 2 Basilisks and 3 units of 3 Bulgrin. Oftentimes we see larger units of Bulgrin, but Ben was just electing to rely on the smaller bricks. 3 units of 10 Kasserkin, because they're rad, bringing 2 Melta-Guns and 2 Plasma Guns apiece alongside their Hotshot Marksman Rifle precision weapon, and more importantly, a Melta-Mine to do several mortal wounds. Those guys can again be murdered, regenerate thanks to reinforcements, and use their Melta-Mine again since an identical unit is added into the army. You can then reuse the spent Melta-Mine. We have 2 Manticores as well as 2 Scout Sentinels to buff the artillery to round out the rest of the artillery contingent, and that is the list. Mostly normal Militarum stuff. Kind of seen the list remain relatively unchanged for the last couple of months for Astra Militarum, and while it's not the most winningest thing in the entire game, it is very consistent and very strong. And with that, we move on to our last faction, Grey Knights, which had a 4-0-1 record at the Fool's Errand GT, run by David Koren. This one was led by Brother Captain Stern. Kind of cool to see him on the table. Brother Captain Stern's actually a relatively interesting include, one that we haven't seen in a while. He can regenerate on a 2+ after being killed, so he actually acts as a bit of a lone operative. He's kind of like an Eldar character with the Phoenix Gem, where you could shoot at him, but it's probably not going to do anything because you're just going to stand back up afterwards. So it takes you 2 full phases to get him off an objective unless he fails his regeneration roll, and you don't really want to bank attacks into a 2+ save. You might rather kill some interceptors or some paladins rather than try to take out Brother Captain Stern, especially if he's hiding himself, and he'll just hold down your backline objectives or perform actions for you just fine. We also had Castellan Crow. He was jumping into a big unit of 10 Purifiers to buff their Purifying Flames. This guy's incredibly good at sweeping infantry, and a unit that we may see actually do fairly well if we are continuing to try to defeat these heavy infantry lists like Adeptus Custodes or even other Grey Knight armies that are running lots of Terminators or lots of 3-wound models. We then had a Grandmaster with the Sigil of Exigence. That guy was jumping into a big unit of Paladins. Kind of the same idea there. The Paladins can bring, I believe, a grand total of like 6 side cannons in the list. The Paladins themselves get 5, and the Grandmaster brings another one into the unit as well. So they're good at killing medium infantry with those 2 damage weapons. If you want to kill the heavier stuff, Nemesis Dread Knights is the way to go, and the army did have a Nemesis Grandmaster with first to the fray, alongside 3 standard Nemesis Dread Knights to add fire support. Last but certainly probably least, we had an Interceptor Squad to act as a utility and to use their double move to score secondary objectives, and an Eversor Assassin for a nice little lone operative scout. And that was the list. Those are the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section which one is your favorite. Remember to come hang out with me on stream this weekend at the ATC Florida. And if you haven't yet already, go check out my live stream VODs from the Midgard GT. Some of the games that we played over there were absolutely nuts. And as always, thanks to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people help me keep the lights on over here in TacticalTortoise HQ, as well as get out to events too, both cover them and live stream them. And I really appreciate all of you. I love you very much. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.